What would you do if the person you trusted most in the world looked you in the eyes while you were at your most broken and chose to leave anyway? Not in anger, not in a fight, just quietly, deliberately, like you were a problem he had already solved in his head. I need you to stay with me for a moment because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that people say couldn't really happen, and then recognize every detail of, because it happened to them. I couldn't believe it the night it happened. I was on the floor of my kitchen in Bristol at 2:53 in the morning. 2 premature babies, a C-section scar that still pulled when I reached too far, and a husband walking out the front door saying he needed space. Not sorry, not I'll be back tomorrow. Space. While 2 11-day-old girls were screaming in the house he was choosing to leave. The shocking truth of that moment didn't fully land until the silence after the door clicked shut, and the silence was enormous. Here's the secret nobody talks about when they tell you about betrayal. It isn't always a screaming fight or a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's a bank account with $312.47 in it that used to have $31,000. Sometimes it's a loan you didn't know existed, taken out in the final weeks of your pregnancy while you were in hospital trusting someone completely. Sometimes it's an Instagram photo of your husband on a beach in the Algarve, tanned, laughing, glass in hand, while you're at home counting nappies and trying to keep the lights on. That's not just cheating. That's not just infidelity. That is a calculated, systematic dismantling of a life. And he assumed I would not recover. He was wrong, and this is the story of how wrong he was. But I need you to understand something before we go any further. This isn't a revenge story in the way you might be imagining. There was no screaming, no confrontation at an airport, no viral moment of public humiliation. What happened instead was quieter, more patient, and in the end, so much more devastating for him. Because while he was out there finding himself, I was finding something that would change everything. Evidence, strategy, and the version of myself I never knew existed until he gave me absolutely no other option. What happened next will surprise you, because the woman who sat on that kitchen floor in the dark, shamed, humiliated, completely alone, is not the woman who walked into that courtroom. And the distance between those 2 women is the whole story. It was 2:53 in the morning when I heard the front door click shut, and I swear the sound cut right through me like a knife. I was sitting on the kitchen floor in Bristol, back against the cold cabinets, 1 baby on each arm, both of them screaming like the world was ending. And honestly, maybe it was. My name is Claire. I was 39 years old, and my twins, Lily and Rose, were just 11 days old, born 6 weeks early, still so fragile I was terrified to breathe wrong around them. And just like that, the man I had built my entire life with walked out into the dark like he had somewhere better to be. Thomas didn't slam the door. That's what I keep coming back to. He didn't slam it. He just closed it softly, like he was trying not to wake anyone up, as if 2 screaming newborns and a wife sitting on the floor in tears wasn't already the loudest thing in the world. I had called out to him, begged him to just wait. Just 5 minutes. Just hold one of them so I could breathe. He turned around, looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not guilt. Something closer to inconvenience. And he said, "I need space, Claire. I'll call you when things settle down." I couldn't believe it. I genuinely could not believe those words came out of his mouth. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It hit me in the chest, in my arms, in my legs that hadn't stopped shaking since I'd come home from the hospital. I had just survived a difficult birth, 2 emergency C-section scares, and 3 days in the NICU praying both girls would be okay. Thomas had been there, or at least his body had been there. His mind, I would later understand, had already left weeks before that door ever closed. The family drama we were living wasn't something that had just started that night. It had been building quietly, underneath a surface I trusted completely. I sat there on that cold kitchen floor for what felt like hours, Lily finally falling asleep on my chest, Rose still whimpering in the crook of my arm. The house felt enormous and suffocating at the same time. The silence Thomas left behind was louder than anything the girls could cry. I kept thinking, is this real? Did I just get abandoned? Not by a boyfriend, not by someone I casually dated, but by my husband, the father of my children, 11 days after they were born. The sheer humiliation of that reality started creeping in somewhere between the second feeding and the first light of dawn. And here's what nobody tells you about moments like this. Your body doesn't shut down when it's supposed to. It keeps going. Because it has to. Because two tiny human beings are depending on every heartbeat you can manage to keep steady. I changed 2 diapers, warmed 2 bottles, and sang the same 3 bars of a lullaby I barely remembered the words to, all while feeling like the ground had completely dissolved beneath me. I wasn't surviving out of strength that night. I was surviving out of pure, desperate love for those 2 little faces that had no idea what their father had just done. But somewhere in that darkness, between the exhaustion and the disbelief, something else was starting. Something quiet. Something I didn't have a name for yet. The first week alone felt like drowning in slow motion. I hadn't slept more than 90 minutes in a row since Lily and Rose came home, and every single minute of those days was calculated survival. Feed 1, burp 1, settle 1, start again with the other. My body was still recovering from the C-section, the scar pulling tight every time I reached for the bassinet, which was approximately 400 times a day. Thomas hadn't called, not once. And every time my phone stayed silent, I felt that betrayal sink just a little bit deeper into my bones. I started keeping a mental list of all the things I thought we'd share. The 3 a.m. shifts, the GP appointments, the terror of watching a premature baby breathe and wondering if the rhythm was right. None of that was on my list anymore. It was just me, 2 daughters who needed everything, and a house in Bristol that suddenly felt like a stage set for a life that no longer existed. The family drama of it all, the sheer absurdity of being a brand new mother completely alone, hadn't hit me as a story yet. It was just hitting me as weight. What I didn't expect was how much the physical exhaustion would feed the emotional collapse. I cried in the shower on day 9 because it was the only place I could let it out without scaring the girls. I cried because I was shamed, not by anyone outside, but by this horrible inner voice that kept asking me what I had missed, what I had done, why he left. And that voice was vicious. It told me I wasn't enough, that this was somehow, in some twisted way, my fault. The lies he had built this exit around weren't visible yet, but their weight was already on my shoulders before I knew what I was carrying. And then the bills started. The electricity reminder, the formula from Boots, the prescription for Rose's reflux medication that cost more than I had budgeted for in a month. I went to check our joint account, not even to transfer anything, just to look, and what I saw made me go completely still. The number on the screen didn't make sense. I refreshed it twice, then a third time, and in that moment, sitting at my kitchen table with a burp cloth still over my shoulder, I understood that what was happening to me wasn't just abandonment. This was something far more calculated than I had let myself consider. He had lied. Not just emotionally, financially, practically, deliberately. And the truth I was about to face was so much worse than I was prepared for. His family stayed silent. Mine was far enough away that help came slowly. The exhaustion I felt wasn't going to break me. But what came next very nearly did. I remember staring at the number on the screen and thinking, maybe I typed the password wrong. Maybe the app glitched. Maybe there's been some kind of bank error, something simple, something fixable. So I logged out, logged back in, and sat completely still while the page loaded. And there it was again. 312,047. That was what was left in the account I had shared with Thomas for 11 years. 11 years of a joint life, joint savings, joint everything. and 312.47 was what remained. What I found out in the next 48 hours was something I still struggle to put into words, without feeling the physical shock of it all over again. Thomas hadn't just taken money. He had drained our joint savings of $31,000, every pound we had carefully put away for the girls, for emergencies, for the future we thought we were building. And as if that weren't enough, he had taken out a personal loan of $9,500 in the final weeks before he left, money I never knew about, using our shared address and his individual credit. He had planned this, quietly, methodically, while I was pregnant, while I was in hospital, while I was learning how to nurse 2 premature babies. He was architecting his exit. The word backstabbed doesn't even come close. There's something uniquely shattering about discovering that someone you slept next to, that someone you trusted with your physical safety and your financial future, was operating an entirely parallel plan that had nothing to do with you. The family betrayal of it wasn't just Thomas leaving. It was Thomas preparing to leave while I was the most vulnerable I had ever been in my life. It was precision, premeditation, and it was the coldest thing I had ever encountered from someone who had once told me he loved me. I sat with that knowledge for about 3 hours before I could move. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there in my kitchen with Lily asleep in the bouncy chair, and Rose bundled on my chest, and I let the full magnitude of what had happened wash over me. Less than 400 pounds, 2 premature babies, no support, unpaid bills, including the council tax reminder that had been sitting unopened on the counter for a week, stacking up like a quiet accusation. I was humiliated in a way I couldn't have anticipated, not publicly, not visibly, but privately, in the most intimate corners of my life. He had gambled on the fact that I'd be too overwhelmed to look closely, too exhausted to ask the right questions. He was almost right. But almost is a very important word. Because while I sat there in that kitchen, something that had been flickering inside me, small, fragile, barely there, started to burn just a little hotter. I wasn't ready to call it strength yet, but I was starting to understand that I couldn't afford not to find it. Her name was Margaret, and she lived just 2 doors down from me in a terraced house with a red front door and a garden full of overgrown lavender. I had always known her the way you know neighbors. A wave across the street, a borrowed umbrella, the occasional exchange about the weather the way people do in Bristol when they're being polite and nothing more. I would never have guessed that this woman, in her early 60s with a no-nonsense Midlands accent, and a gift for showing up at precisely the right moment, would become the most important person in my life during those first devastating weeks. She knocked on my door on a Thursday afternoon carrying a casserole dish, a packet of biscuits, and a look on her face that told me she already knew something was wrong. I don't know how. Maybe it was the curtains I'd stopped opening. Maybe it was the way my car hadn't moved in days. But when I opened the door, hair unwashed, eyes swollen, Rose screaming in the background, Margaret didn't flinch. She just said, "Right then. Let me in, love. I'll take one while you eat something real." And that was it. She came in, picked up Rose without hesitation, and looked at me until I sat down. What Margaret gave me in those first moments wasn't pity. It was ground. She didn't catastrophize, didn't gasp at the details when I told her what Thomas had done, the disappearance, the money, the calculated family drama he had left in his wake. She just listened. And when I finished, she set her tea down and said, "He's done you dirty, Claire. No question, and you're going to feel that for a while, but you cannot afford to just feel it." Those words landed differently than comfort would have. They landed like a door opening. She started coming by every other day. Sometimes she'd bring food from Sainsbury's. Sometimes she'd just sit with me while I fed the girls, talking about ordinary things, her garden, a documentary she'd watched, the new bakery on the high street. Anything that reminded me the world outside my grief still existed and still had small, decent pleasures in it. She was the first person to make me laugh after Thomas left. A real laugh, not the nervous kind. And I didn't know how starved I had been for that until I heard the sound coming out of me and felt shocked that I still could. But Margaret was also the first person to say what nobody else had said yet. "Have you spoken to anyone legal, sweetheart? Because what he's done isn't just unkind. It might be something the law has a word for." I hadn't thought about it that way. I had been so buried in survival that the idea of strategy hadn't occurred to me yet. She planted a seed that Thursday afternoon, quietly, between a spoonful of casserole and a sleeping baby. And something about the way she said it made me think, maybe this isn't just a wound. Maybe this is a case. It was my friend Diane who made the practical piece click into place. She drove up from London on a Friday, 2 weeks after Thomas left, and arrived with her laptop, a legal pad, a box of pens, and the kind of calm determination that made me realize I had been moving through water while she had been standing on solid ground. Diane was an accountant, the kind of person whose brain is organized like a filing cabinet, clean, indexed, ready. She took one look at the chaos of my kitchen table, scattered receipts, unopened letters, formula coupons, and bill reminders mixed together. And she sat down and didn't say a word until she'd sorted it into piles. "You need a new account," was the first thing she said. Not hello. Not how are you. Just that. And she was right. I opened a new bank account the following Monday morning. Girls in the pram, fresh account in my name alone, with a PIN. Thomas would never know, and a statement he would never see. It was the first deliberate act I had taken since the night he left. And the feeling of it, of doing something on purpose instead of just reacting, was more powerful than I expected. I was reclaiming something. Small, yes, but mine. It didn't happen overnight. It took weeks before I could even think clearly enough to do more than that single step at a time. Diane set up a spreadsheet on my laptop and taught me how to track every single pound coming in and going out. Formula, nappies, prescriptions, utilities, every line item recorded, every due date flagged, every standing order that had Thomas's signature on it either canceled or redirected. She made it feel like evidence gathering before I even understood that's what we were doing. "Document everything," she kept saying, tapping the screen. "Every message, every missed call, every bill you've had to pay alone, every date he was absent. Write it all down." I didn't fully understand why yet, but I trusted her enough to start. The first time I balanced my new budget and found I was, barely, just barely, going to make it through the month, I cried. Not from sadness, but from something else, something harder to name. Relief, maybe, or the first distant glimpse of dignity. I had been so afraid of the numbers that I'd been avoiding them, letting the fear grow bigger than the actual reality. Bringing it into the light, even ugly and tight as it was, made it something I could work with, something I could fight. And here's what I noticed, slowly, across those first 2 organized weeks. I was starting to think differently, not just about money, but about everything. The fog was thinning. I was waking up at 5 a.m. not just from the girls, but from ideas, things to document, calls to make, questions I needed answers to. There were also transactions in the old statements I didn't fully understand yet. Small amounts moved in patterns that didn't quite fit. The survival instinct was still there, but something sharper was starting to grow underneath it. I just didn't know yet how sharp it was going to need to be. His name was James Hartley, and his office was on the 3rd floor of a building near the Bristol city center that smelled like old carpet and serious decisions. I almost didn't go. I almost convinced myself that legal advice was for people with more resources, more certainty, more clarity about what they were doing. But Margaret's voice was in my head, and Diane had written the address down and said, "Just go, Claire. Just go and hear what he says." So I bundled the girls into the car, left them with Margaret for 2 hours, and walked into that office shaking. James Hartley was not what I expected. He was calm in a way that felt deliberate, like he'd sat with 100 women in my exact situation and learned that calm was the most useful thing he could offer. He listened without interrupting while I explained everything. The disappearance, the drained account, the loan Thomas had taken out, the unpaid bills, the complete absence. When I finished, he leaned forward slightly and said something that changed the entire structure of how I understood my situation. What your husband has done, legally, classifies as abandonment. And abandonment in a marriage, particularly with dependent newborns, gives you significant legal leverage you may not realize you have. I couldn't believe it. I had come into that office thinking I was the one without options, the one at a disadvantage, the one scrambling to catch up to a man who had taken everything and disappeared. And James was telling me, quietly, precisely, that Thomas had actually handed me something. Every day he stayed gone was adding to a legal record. Every bill I'd paid alone was documentation. Every message I'd sent that he hadn't answered was evidence. The betrayal, the financial misconduct, the family betrayal. All of it was building a case I hadn't known I was living inside. He explained what steps I could take, filing for temporary custody now, which would establish legal responsibility in my favor before Thomas ever returned. Applying for emergency child maintenance through the court system, requesting a full financial disclosure, which would require Thomas to account for every pound he had moved. The justice I had been wanting was already within reach of existing systems. I just needed to step into them deliberately, and James was going to help me do that. I walked out of that office 2 hours later with a notepad full of instructions, a follow-up appointment booked, and something I hadn't felt since the night Thomas left. Forward motion. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I had a direction. And the man who had thought he could simply vanish and leave me to fall apart had absolutely no idea that while he was out there finding himself, I had just found something far more important. It was a Tuesday, late morning, girls napping for exactly 22 minutes. I know because I was timing everything by then, measuring my life in the gaps between their sleep cycles. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and my phone, going through my emails, when a notification appeared from Instagram. Thomas's account. Public. Like he'd never thought to check the settings. Like the idea of me looking had never even occurred to him. And there he was, a photograph. Thomas on a beach. Somewhere that looked like the Algarve. Golden light, turquoise water. One of those restaurants right on the sand. He was tanned, laughing. He had a glass of something in his hand and his arm around a woman I didn't recognize, and his face had the relaxed, unburdened expression of someone who had absolutely not a single care in the world. My husband, who had left me with 2 premature babies, drained our bank account, and taken out a secret loan, was on holiday. I couldn't believe it. I sat there and read that caption twice. Needed this. The word humiliated doesn't quite capture what I felt in that moment. It was deeper than humiliation. It was the full, visceral confirmation that to Thomas, none of what I was living through had registered as real enough to disrupt his plans. The sleepless nights, the C-section scar, the formula bills, the court paperwork I was quietly beginning to build, none of it. He was out there being tan and unbothered while I was here being forged. And somewhere in the white-hot shock of that photograph, something final crystallized in me. I screenshotted it. Every single image, every location tag, every smiling face, every casual caption that proved, with a time and date stamp, that he was traveling, spending, living, while legally responsible children were at home without his support. Diane had told me to document everything. I don't think she knew I'd ever have material this rich to work with. The infidelity angle was still a question mark, but the abandonment, the shaming, the complete disregard? That was all right there in his own public profile, archived and ready. I cried exactly once that day. In the shower, for about 4 minutes. And then I stopped, got out, got dressed, picked up my phone, and sent James Hartley an email with 15 screenshots attached and a subject line that just said, "More evidence." The grief was still there, it didn't disappear. But I had learned something important about where to put it. And now I was starting to understand exactly what kind of woman this situation was turning me into. There's a moment, and I remember it exactly, when something shifted in the way I was moving through my own life. It was a Wednesday night, maybe 6 weeks after Thomas had left. The girls were finally asleep before 10, which felt like a miracle. I had eaten a real meal, not toast, not cereal, but an actual plate of food I had cooked. I sat down at the kitchen table, opened the folder Diane had helped me create, and looked at everything I had gathered. Bank statements, screenshots, a log of every bill I'd paid alone, a timeline of every message Thomas had ignored, James's legal notes from our second meeting. And I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It came through habits. The habit of writing things down, of checking the folder before I went to bed, of thinking 3 steps ahead instead of just responding to whatever crisis the day brought. I started researching family law late at night while the girls slept. I learned the difference between temporary and full custody. I learned what financial disclosure meant and how courts evaluated it. I learned that the karma of what Thomas had done, the planning, the draining of our account, the secret loan, the disappearance, wasn't just morally offensive. It was legally significant. What changed most profoundly was my internal voice, that vicious one that had asked me what I'd done wrong, what I'd missed, why he'd left. It got quieter. Not because I had answers, but because I stopped asking those questions. They belonged to the version of me that was waiting for Thomas to come back and explain himself. The version of me sitting at that kitchen table with a color-coded folder did not need his explanation. She needed his financial records. She needed court dates. She needed to be very, very prepared for what was coming. There were nights I almost called him. Almost. I'd pick up the phone, scroll to his name, and just put it back down. Not out of pride, out of something harder and clearer than pride. I started sleeping differently. Not more, the girls still made sure of that, but deeper when I did. I stopped rehearsing conversations with him in my head and began using that mental energy for something more useful. The exact sequence of legal moves James and I had mapped out, the documentation I still needed to gather, the careful, quiet architecture of a justice that Thomas would not see coming until it arrived. The self-worth I'd been hemorrhaging since the night he left was returning. Not because he had come back, but because I had stopped needing him to. I wasn't angry in a hot, reactive way anymore. I was something different now. Still, focused, and absolutely clear that the payback wasn't going to be loud or dramatic or satisfying in the way revenge fantasies usually are. It was going to be measured and methodical and final. And the man on that beach in the Algarve with his wine glass and his tan and his "needed this" caption, he had absolutely no idea what was being assembled in his absence. I repainted the hallway on a Saturday. This might sound like the smallest, most irrelevant detail in the middle of everything else I've told you, but it wasn't. I chose the color myself. A soft sage green, completely different from the gray Thomas had insisted on 3 years earlier because he said it looked more modern. I stood in that hallway with a roller in my hand, Lily and Rose in the bouncy chairs watching me from the doorway, and I painted over every last inch of his choice with mine. And I know how it sounds, but in that moment it felt like the clearest metaphor I'd ever lived inside. Stability, I learned, isn't something that descends on you when the chaos ends. It's something you build, deliberately, repeatedly, in tiny decisions that add up to something solid. I made routine the structure my daughters could depend on, because I couldn't give them a father. Morning feeds at the same time, afternoon walks in the same park, evening bath with the same songs. Predictability wasn't boring. It was love made practical, and it was the most grounding thing I could offer 2 premature babies who had already known too much disruption. Reclaiming our home meant filling it with our rhythms, not his absence. The finances were still tight, uncomfortably tight. But I had stopped being afraid of the spreadsheet. I knew every number. I knew exactly where every pound was going and how much runway I had before the next bill needed covering. I had applied for the interim maintenance James had advised, and while that process was slow, it was moving. Every week I crossed something off the legal checklist felt like a small, precise act of justice. Not the dramatic, door-slamming kind, the kind that actually holds up, that goes on record, that has consequences with teeth. I also started doing something I hadn't done in years. I contacted my former employer. I had been working in HR before the pregnancy, and when I reached out to explain my situation, they were more understanding than I had any right to hope for. There were options, a gradual return, flexible arrangements for the first few months. Nothing was guaranteed, but the conversation itself felt seismic. I wasn't dependent on Thomas's return, or Thomas's money, or Thomas's anything. I was looking at a future that was mine to architect, and the ground was getting steadier under my feet every single day. One evening, I sat in the living room after the girls went down, and I realized the house didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like mine. The plants were watered. The kitchen was clean. There were 2 small sleep suits drying on the rack by the radiator, and photographs of Lily and Rose on the wall that I had framed myself, hung slightly crooked the way I liked. And somewhere in the warmth of that ordinary Tuesday evening, it hit me. The man who had left me here to fall apart had instead given me the space to build something better. But he didn't know that yet, and the moment he'd find out was getting closer every single day. James had told me from the very beginning, timing is everything in family law. And by the time Thomas had been gone for 11 weeks, 3 months almost to the day, we were ready. Not emotionally ready. Not in the sense that I had no feelings left about any of it, but strategically, legally, documentarily ready in a way that had been built one careful week at a time. The folder that had started as a handful of screenshots and bank statements was now nearly 2 inches thick, tabbed and dated, telling a story so clear and so complete that James had called it one of the most thorough evidence packages he'd seen from a self-represented client. We filed for temporary custody first. The application cited abandonment, Thomas's voluntary, unannounced departure from the family home with no communication, no financial provision, no established return date. It cited the financial misconduct, the $31,000 drained from savings, the $9,500 loan taken without disclosure, the $312.47 he had left me with. It cited the documented absence across 11 weeks, the unanswered messages, the Instagram evidence of an active social life being lived while legally dependent children were unsupported. Every detail I had recorded, every screenshot Diane had told me to take, every bill I had kept, every date and time I had logged, all of it was in that file. All of it was now in front of a judge. The child maintenance application went in the same week. James filed both simultaneously, a tactical decision, not a hasty one. The goal was to have both processes moving through the system before Thomas returned, so that when he did come back, the legal framework would already be in place. He wouldn't be walking back into the same house with the same woman in the same situation he'd left. He'd be walking into a jurisdiction that had already started making decisions about him without his input. And that was exactly the point. I remember the morning the court acknowledgement letters arrived. 2 envelopes, same day, both addressed to me as the applicant. I sat at the kitchen table, opened them carefully, and read them twice. There was nothing celebratory about the moment. It was more like the satisfaction of locking something into place, like hearing a bolt slide home in a door you've finally gotten the key to fit. The system that Thomas had never worried about because he'd assumed I was too overwhelmed to use it was now in motion. And it was moving with information he didn't know I had. What I felt in those weeks wasn't vengeance in the explosive, satisfying way people imagine revenge. It was something quieter and more precise. It was the feeling of having converted every single thing he had done to me. The betrayal, the abandonment, the financial dishonesty, The humiliation of that holiday photo into structured, admissible, court-ready documentation. He had lied to me. He had cheated me out of our financial future. And now, every single one of those lies was going to be read aloud in a room where they actually had weight. The only thing left was for him to walk back through the door. He called on a Thursday afternoon, just like that. After 11 weeks of silence, after I had stopped listening for his name in my notifications, after I had rebuilt an entire life around his absence. My phone rang, and there was Thomas's name on the screen, and I stood in the kitchen looking at it for exactly 3 rings before I answered. Claire. That's how he opened. One word. Like he'd rehearsed something longer, and then decided against it. I said hello. Calm, measured, almost bored, which I could tell surprised him. He said he was coming back next week. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking, and he wanted to figure things out. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask about Lily and Rose by name. He said he assumed I was managing and that we could talk when he got back, sort things out between us, that he hoped things weren't too complicated. I listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, I said, "Okay, Thomas, we'll talk." And then I hung up and immediately sent James a message that said, "He's coming back Thursday week. We need to move." The week before he came home, I changed very little about the surface of the house. I didn't want to signal anything. I let the hallway look like a normal hallway, the kitchen like a normal kitchen. But I moved the folder to my locked filing cabinet, confirmed all the court paperwork was processed, updated James on the timeline, and contacted my HR manager to confirm the start date for my return to work. I was not the woman Thomas had left. I didn't need to announce that. The documents already had. When he walked through the front door that Thursday, there was a moment, I won't lie, where I felt the old pull. Not love, exactly. More like grief for what had been real before it wasn't. He looked different, thinner, tanned from the holiday I'd seen on Instagram. He looked around the house slowly, taking in the clean surfaces, the framed photographs, the order he hadn't left behind. And something in his face changed. He had expected chaos. He had built his entire return around the assumption of chaos. And when he didn't find it, I watched something shift behind his eyes before he even said a word. He said the girls were beautiful, holding them with a careful awkwardness that told me he had forgotten how small they were. And then he sat down, and he started to speak as if we were going to negotiate his re-entry. I let him talk. I did not interrupt. And when he'd finished outlining his vision of how things might settle back to normal, I looked at him evenly and said, "Thomas, I need you to know that there are some legal matters that have already been initiated. You'll want to speak to a solicitor." The color left his face in a way I'd never seen before. He asked what I meant. I told him, plainly and without emotion, about the custody filing, the maintenance application, the financial disclosure order. I watched his expression move through confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to the truth. He had miscalculated, and I had been very, very busy in his absence. The hearing was on a gray Wednesday morning in October, the kind of Bristol morning where the sky looks like wet concrete and the cold gets into everything. I wore a navy blazer I'd bought in the second month of his absence, one deliberate, confident purchase I'd made for exactly this occasion. James was beside me. Thomas sat across the room with a solicitor he'd scrambled to find in the 3 weeks between his return and the court date. Not enough time to build a proper case, which James had noted with quiet satisfaction when we'd discussed the timeline. The judge was a woman in her 50s, efficient and unreadable. James presented our evidence chronologically. The joint account balance before and after Thomas left, the $31,000 withdrawal, the $9,500 loan taken without disclosure, the bank records showing exactly when and how the money had moved. He showed the timeline of abandoned messages, the 11-week record of zero financial contribution. The court submitted evidence of travel expenditure during the period of claimed abandonment. And then, almost as an aside, almost gently, the Instagram screenshots. Thomas on the beach, Thomas at restaurants, Thomas with his glass in his hand and his arm around a woman and his "needed this" caption underneath. I couldn't see Thomas's face from where I was sitting, but I could see his solicitors, and what I saw there told me everything I needed to know. She had not known about the Instagram. Thomas had not been fully honest with his own legal counsel, which, as James later explained, is exactly the kind of thing that unravels a case from the inside. The financial misconduct was documented. The abandonment was documented. The infidelity suggested by the photographs was a thread the judge noted she found of interest for the full proceedings to come. The ruling that day was temporary but decisive. I was granted full interim custody of Lily and Rose. Thomas was ordered to begin child maintenance payments immediately at a rate calculated from his income which the financial disclosure had now formally placed on record. A full financial review was scheduled to examine the missing funds, the unauthorized loan, and all movement of marital assets during the year prior to separation. Thomas's solicitor asked for additional time. The judge looked at the timeline of the case, looked at the evidence file, and declined. I didn't feel triumphant when we walked out of that building. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something more specific. A kind of deep, quiet settling, like something that had been held at an unnatural angle had finally been straightened. The justice wasn't fireworks. It was a court order. It was a file number. It was the specific, undeniable consequence of a man who had thought his family was a problem he could simply walk away from. He had lied. He had cheated. He had run. And the system had taken very careful, very detailed notes. I heard through a mutual friend, the way you always hear things you didn't specifically ask to know, that Thomas had cried in his car after the first hearing. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because I think it's important context for what I'm about to tell you. He had never cried in front of me. Not when I was in hospital, not when the girls were in the NICU, not when he walked out the door at 2:53 in the morning. But alone in a car park outside a family court in Bristol, the consequences of his choices apparently found a way through. The financial review uncovered things neither James nor I had anticipated. The $9,500 loan wasn't the only one. There was a second account Thomas had opened 6 months before leaving, a personal account I hadn't known existed, into which money had been moved in small, calculated amounts for almost a year. Those transactions I hadn't understood in the early statements, those quiet, regular little movements, were all explained now. The disclosure also revealed expenditure during his holiday that far exceeded what he had claimed his finances could support. The same man who had left me with $312.47 had spent over $4,000 in the Algarve in 10 days. That number, that specific, receipted, documented number, landed in the courtroom the way karma tends to land, quietly, precisely, and with total authority. His professional life wasn't immune either. The maintenance order was substantial enough that it changed the financial reality he'd constructed in his absence. The life he'd been imagining, unburdened, reconfigured, free, required the level of income he had, and the court now had a very detailed picture of that income and exactly what it was obligated to support. The payback wasn't something I had engineered directly. It was the natural structural consequence of a man who had stolen, run, and assumed he'd never have to account for any of it. The vengeance wasn't mine. It was the law's. I had just given it the evidence it needed. The woman in the Algarve photos was apparently someone he'd met during a previous work trip, a detail that emerged as the full financial picture was assembled, because her name appeared in transaction records Thomas had been required to disclose. The infidelity wasn't legally central, but it was emotionally defining, not because it hurt me the way it might have before all of this, but because it confirmed what I had slowly come to understand. Thomas had not left to find himself. He had left to escape the version of his life that required anything from him. Our daughters, our home, me, all of it. too inconvenient for the freedom he'd decided he deserved. I watched him walk to his car after one of the later hearings. He looked smaller than I remembered him. Not physically, but something about the weight of consequence had taken the ease out of the way he moved, the lightness that had always been in his step, even the night he walked out. He didn't look at me. I didn't need him to. The shamed, exposed, legally accountable version of Thomas Mitchell was no longer my concern. My concern was in the car, two little girls in their seats waiting for their mother, and their mother had somewhere to be. It has been 3 years. I know that's the kind of sentence that sounds like a summary, like the shorthand version of something enormous. And it is. 3 years from the kitchen floor to the life I'm sitting in right now, which I would not have been able to imagine on that morning I found 312.47 in an account I'd trusted. Lily and Rose are 3 years old. They are loud and curious and opinionated and absolutely, completely everything. They have their grandmother's nose and, as it turns out, their mother's stubbornness, which I consider a feature rather than a flaw. I went back to work 9 months after Thomas left. Part-time first, then full-time, then, and I still feel a quiet pride when I say this, a promotion into a senior HR role I'd actually been considered for before the pregnancy and never quite believed I'd reach. The self-worth I'd had to rebuild from the ground up turned out to be more durable than the original, because I knew exactly what it was made of now. I had built it deliberately, consciously, with every decision I'd made when no one was watching. Every hour I'd stayed up documenting instead of despairing. Every morning I'd gotten up and been a mother and a strategist and a woman in the same body at the same time. Thomas pays his child maintenance, consistently on schedule because he has to. We communicate about the girls through a co-parenting app, brief, functional, businesslike. He has supervised visits. The girls know him the way you know someone at a careful distance. They're not traumatized. And I've worked hard to make sure of that, because they are not the inheritors of my anger. They are the beneficiaries of my choices. There is a difference, and I hold on to that difference very carefully. The house in Bristol, my house now, legally established in the financial proceedings, has the sage green hallway, 2 small beds with fairy lights above them, a kitchen that smells like whatever I've decided to cook that week, and a quiet in the evenings that used to feel like emptiness, but now feels like peace. I didn't get here by winning an argument with Thomas or screaming my truth or making a dramatic scene in an airport or anywhere else. I got here by showing up, documenting, consulting a lawyer, opening a bank account, painting a hallway, and refusing, day after day, to let the betrayal be the last word about who I was. I want to be clear about something. The revenge, if you want to call it that, was never about hurting him. I'm not sure I even have the energy to want that anymore. What it was about, what it has always been about, was reclaiming something he had tried to take from me. My security, my dignity, my sense of what I was capable of. The payback wasn't dramatic. It was structural. It was a court order, a new account, a promotion, 2 daughters who know that their mother is someone who does not fold. That is what justice looked like for me. Not fireworks, not a moment of his suffering. Just the quiet, extraordinary fact of my own rebuilt life. It wasn't perfect. It never is. But it was mine. Completely, undeniably mine. Here is the thing about real victory that no one tells you when you're sitting on a kitchen floor at 2:53 in the morning with 2 babies and a husband who just walked out. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like arriving. Slow, quiet, private. More like the moment a fog lifts than any kind of fanfare. The true turning point of my story wasn't the court hearing. It wasn't the maintenance order. It wasn't even the sage green hallway or the promotion or the financial disclosure that laid bare everything Thomas had tried to hide. It was a Tuesday morning, 18 months after he left, when I got the girls dressed, made breakfast, sent an email to my manager, scheduled a call with James's office about a final financial matter, and did not think about Thomas once until I sat down to write this. The word vengeance implies an explosion, something visible, something loud, something that makes the person who hurt you flinch in real time. What I learned is that the most devastating form of it is quieter than that. It's watching someone who bet on your collapse watch you build something they couldn't have imagined. It's the karma of a man who ran from responsibility, spending years inside a legal and financial framework that holds him accountable whether he likes it or not. It's the reclaiming of a life so completely that the person who tried to derail it becomes irrelevant to the daily fact of your own existence. I think about what I would say to the version of me who sat on that floor. I would tell her that the humiliation she felt would not define her. That the shaming, the private, devastating kind, the kind that asks you what you did wrong in the dark, would pass. But the clarity she was about to find would not. I would tell her that the self-worth she thought she'd lost was not gone. It was just waiting for her to stop looking for it in someone else's behavior and start looking for it in her own. I would tell her to screenshot everything. The dignity I walk around with now isn't borrowed from anyone or built on top of someone else's downfall. It's mine, built from the spreadsheets and the legal appointments and the late nights and the mornings I showed up anyway, and the times I cried in the shower and got out and kept going. The infidelity, the lies, the financial betrayal, the backstabbing of a man who chose his own comfort over his family. All of it is in the past tense now. It happened. It is not happening. That distinction took me a long time to earn, and I protect it accordingly. I used to think that surviving something meant making it stop hurting. I know now that it means something different. It means becoming someone the hurt couldn't stop. Thomas left to find himself. I stayed. And in staying, in building, in fighting, in refusing, in choosing, day after day to reclaim what was mine, I found something far more durable than whatever he went looking for. I found out exactly who I am when I have absolutely no one left to depend on. And it turns out, she's someone worth fighting for. So let me ask you something before we close this out. And I want you to think about it. Really think about it. Not just scroll past. If you had been in Claire's position, no money, no sleep, 2 newborns, a door that just clicked shut, what would you have done in that first week? Would you have fallen apart completely? Or is there something in you that would have quietly started building, the way she did, even before you knew that's what you were doing? Because here's what I keep thinking about. Claire didn't have a plan on that kitchen floor. She had desperation. And desperation, in the right hands, the right organized, documented, spreadsheet-building hands, turns into something entirely different. She didn't set out to trap Thomas. She set out to survive. And survival, done with enough precision, looks an awful lot like justice. So tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better? Have you ever been left, financially, emotionally, practically, by someone who assumed you wouldn't know what to do? Drop it in the comments. Because I promise you, you are not alone, and your story matters more than you think. And if you've been through something like this, infidelity, financial betrayal, abandonment, or any version of someone betting on your collapse, I want to hear it, not to collect pain, but because the most powerful thing a story can do is make another person feel less alone in the middle of theirs. Share your experience below. Be honest. Be raw if you need to. This is a space where the truth is always more welcome than the polished version. If this story made you feel something, anger, recognition, hope, or all 3 at once, then you already know what this channel is about. We don't do surface level here. We don't do simple. We go into the places that other content doesn't want to touch, because that's where the real understanding lives. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story we're covering involves a woman who found out something about her family that made everything she thought she knew about her own life completely collapse. And what she did about it is something no one will see coming. You do not want to miss it.